When they're done right, journalism, jiu-jitsu, and history have one thing in common. They're all disciplines of information verification. They're all concerned with finding out what's true. Sometimes in order to find out what's true, you got to figure out what's not true first through a painful process of trial and error. I think about that a lot when I think about Professor John J. O'Brien, one of the first jiu-jitsu instructors in America around the turn of the last century. And yeah, they called them professor back then too. When you want to verify whether information is good information or bad information, it's important to think about the motivations of the speaker. Why are they telling me this? Why are they telling me this in this way? I think about this not just with O'Brien itself, but the way the media covered him. O'Brien spent 4 years in Japan as a police constable at Nagasaki Station in Nagasaki, where he learned some jiu-jitsu, and all of that is verifiable. So unlike other people who were publishing about jiu-jitsu at the time, he'd done some training. We're going to do several videos about O'Brien because if he wasn't the first jiu-jitsu instructor in America, he was certainly one of the first, and as such, really historically significant. In 1900, he brought his instructor, Kishoko Inoue, around to do a barnstorming tour throughout San Francisco, where he taught at the Olympic Club, taught some women's groups, taught some police, and ended with this amazing page in the San Francisco Call from February of 1900. O'Brien got a lot of media coverage, and a lot of it framed it like this: the man knows how to break your arms, break your legs, he's a policeman, he has this kind of credibility. He also wrote a book about jiu-jitsu and physical culture, which you can still get today, both online or a hard copy. Should you get it? More on that later. O'Brien gave lessons to at least one person you've definitely heard of, and he also gave lessons to a guy you almost definitely haven't heard of named Tate McKenzie, and I can't wait to make that video, which will probably come next week. But how most people remember him is as President Theodore Roosevelt's first instructor, and we're going to do a whole video just about O'Brien and Roosevelt because there is a lot to unpack there. And yes, that picture from the beginning of the video is right next to the picture of Theodore Roosevelt, putting those two men on the same footing with the same size of photo, which tells you a lot about media coverage at the time. Also, I love that a random and unrelated story to this How the President is Taught Jiu-Jitsu story has the headline, "The Death Roll of Our Great Men." Had nothing to do with jiu-jitsu, but love the coincidence. Before he started teaching Roosevelt in 1902, though, he was successful at getting media coverage in other places. In 1901, he started writing for the New York World, teaching jiu-jitsu lessons about how a woman can defeat a pickpocket, for example. He wasn't just teaching self-defense for women, though. He would teach men how to defend against brawlers who were trying to throttle them, stuff that would show up in self-defense classes years later as well. Public demonstrations at theaters and vaudeville shows were also really important to the early transmission of jiu-jitsu, and so O'Brien wasn't just writing about it in the newspaper. This is from November 1900, where the boxer Gentleman Jim Corbett, who actually won the World Heavyweight Championship, gets into a public demonstration with O'Brien and Inoue and ends up getting thrown with a wrist lock. This is not a technique video, although I'll definitely make one of those because I think the progression from traditional jiu-jitsu to judo to jiu-jitsu and the cross-pollination between all three is super fascinating. Suffice it to say, some of the moves that O'Brien was showing and Inoue was showing are recognizable as throws that we would see today in some form or another. Or there are things like this one that is sort of a proto-rear naked choke, or what judoka would call a hadaka-jime. Then there was other stuff like this gem from O'Brien's book, which is not recognizable as judo or jiu-jitsu. My man hit him with the hey mo. And this is where we get back to information verification. Why is this person or media outlet telling me this? What is their motivation for telling me this in this way? O'Brien came back to America in 1900, started teaching. In 1901, he started writing for the New York World. In 1902, he was introduced to President Roosevelt and started teaching him. And in 1902, that same year, the New York World wrote this article, How the President is Taught Jiu-Jitsu, which is still fascinating. I want you to take a look at this headline here. Famous expert now putting the chief executive through a course like the one he gave to our readers. It was in the New York World's best interest to frame O'Brien as a true expert in jiu-jitsu. Was he? Well, we'll get into that in successive videos, and I don't want to spoil the O'Brien Teaches Roosevelt video, which we'll put out next week, too much, but I will point out that in 1904, Professor Yoshitsugu Yamashita from the Kodokan started teaching Roosevelt, and shortly thereafter, O'Brien wrote Roosevelt's personal secretary this letter, which you can see on the Theodore Roosevelt Center website. He asks the president not to show any of the stuff that he showed Roosevelt to the Japanese delegation, and he explains that it's because so much of it was his own system that he had developed out of the Japanese system. So that's a preview for next week. Whatever percentage of the jiu-jitsu that O'Brien was teaching he learned from Inoue, and whatever percentage he developed on his own, he did continue to teach it for decades later. And here we find him in 1906 teaching a catch wrestler, George Bothner, some of the tricks that he used. Bothner himself would have a really memorable match with Katsugumi Higashi, which we'll talk about. Whatever we think of the techniques he was teaching, it's impossible to overestimate the impact John O'Brien had on jiu-jitsu in America. Even if he'd never taught the president, he'd still be one of the first instructors and the one generating media coverage that caused jiu-jitsu to become a fad. He was really instrumental to that first wave of jiu-jitsu from 1900 to 1906, and there are a couple of other things I'm excited to tell you about, including a letter he got in 1913. So stay tuned.